There's an apocryphal phrase given to Arno Amory, the ecclesiastical leader of this army, when asked if the Crusaders should be ordered to stop. He is attributed with saying, "Kill them all, God will know his own."
Welcome to Witch Hunt, the podcast building context for understanding witch trials. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
And I'm Sarah Jack. Today we're exploring the Albigensian Crusade, a massive persecution campaign that established patterns later seen in witch hunts across Europe and colonial America.
Our guest is Louis Pulford, who recently completed his PhD at Lancaster University, studying the Historia Albigensis, a detailed contemporary account of the crusade written by a monk who participated in it.
We'll learn about the Cathars, a religious group in southern France accused of heresy, and how the Catholic Church's response to them created methods of persecution that would be used for centuries to come.
The parallels between this 13th century crusade and later witch hunts are striking.
Let's get started with our interview with Louis Pulford. Thank you for coming on Witch Hunt Podcast. It was so nice to see you at the Witchcraft and Human Rights Conference in Lancaster. Can you tell us who you are and about your interests and expertise?
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me onto the podcast. It was lovely to meet you at the conference too. I'm Louis Pulford. I'm a recent PhD from Lancaster University, where I've been working in conducting my doctoral research in the history department. Before that, I undertook my undergraduate and master's degrees at the University of East Anglia, chiefly focused on the Albigensian Crusade, quite specifically on one of the most detailed contemporary narratives of the Albigensian Crusade, which is written by a monk, Peter de Senay, who participated in the Albigensian Crusade and was quite involved with the leadership of the Crusade. And my research offers the first modern detailed analysis of his text, which is called the Historia Albigensis. And that's the topic of my PhD research.
And it was wonderful hearing your talk at the Witchcraft and Human Rights Conference. You really pointed out how the Albigensian Crusade established a pattern of persecution that had echoes later on in the witch hunts. What can you tell us about the Albigensian Crusade?
I think the Albigensian Crusade is something that I think not many people have heard of, and those who have heard of it aren't necessarily entirely clear what it is. So I think if I speak to what the Crusade actually was, and then get stuck into some of the methods of persecution that are detectable in the Crusade, the Albigensian Crusade was the first crusade undertaken against those living in Christendom itself. During the late 11th century and throughout the 12th century, you have the more commonly known crusading movement, which was undertaken against Muslims in the Holy Land in an effort to retake Jerusalem and the holy places, but also other crusading efforts, such as those in Spain, trying to drive Islamic rule out of Spain, and also increasingly in the Baltic Sea, where you have armed conversion movements, essentially, from the late 12th century onwards. What you have in the Albigensian Crusade is an internal campaign against the enemies of Christianity, essentially. And it's undertaken against a sect of those accused of being heretics in the south of France, in a region chiefly called the Languedoc. I don't know how well your listeners know their French geography, but it's central southern, around the cities of Toulouse and Carcassonne and Béziers. And it emerges from quite a long period of concern on the part of the church authorities about these what they perceive to be religious dissidents in the south of France. And from the mid-1140s onwards, you have preachers. I can say maybe a little bit more about who these preachers were later, because that's quite interesting. But preachers going to the south of France and conducting preaching tours where they preached against the heretics of the region and tried to convert them back to orthodoxy. These carry on. It follows church legislation. This is an era of great church councils. And in 1179, you have the Third Lateran Council, where Pope Alexander II calls a great church council in Rome. And one of their chief concerns is that of heresy. And at this point, you get the first church legislation for an armed response to heresy introduced, in that a papal legate or churchman can lead an armed force against heresy, according to the Third Lateran Council. And that happens. A small force is led in 1181 by Henry of Albano, who is the abbot of Clairvaux, and the papal legate leads a force against the castle of Laval, or town of Laval, and besieges the heretics that are in there. But it all comes to a head in 1208, when actually the papal legate of the time, Michael Pierre of Castelnau, is murdered, seemingly by agents of Raymond VI of Toulouse, who is the overlord of this region of France and is accused of protecting heretics. He views heretics as his subjects and gives shelter to them. He is accused of overseeing the murder of the papal legate, and Pope Innocent III calls a crusade against them. To start with, it's the vice-counties of Carcassonne and Béziers, and the crusading army is levied and goes south. And throughout the first campaign is led by the Duke of Burgundy and the Count of Nevers, as well as a new papal legate. There's a lot of papal legates, called Arnaud Amaury, who's the abbot of a place called Citeaux, which is quite important in this story, leads the army. But following that first campaign, in which the towns of Carcassonne and Béziers are quite mercilessly sacked, a new leader emerges, who's a man called Simon de Montfort, who's the lord of a small holding in northern France, 35 kilometers southwest of Paris. He's from that region. I should say, speaking to patterns of persecution, this first campaign is quite marked for its savagery against the populace of Languedoc. And the town of Béziers especially is sacked especially brutally. And there's an apocryphal phrase given to Arnaud Amaury, the ecclesiastical leader of this army, when asked if the Crusaders should be ordered to stop. He is attributed with saying, "Kill them all, God will know his own." It's unlikely that he did say that, but that sums up the attitude taken in that first campaign quite well. And Béziers, the entire populace, is essentially massacred. Moving forwards under the leadership of Simon de Montfort, the crusade, it doesn't lessen in brutality, but it settles into a pattern of persecution far more. And he leads the crusade from 1209 to 1218, when he dies outside the walls of Toulouse. And what you get here is essentially he and a small group of knights lay siege to all the individual castles of the region. This region is known for its political fragmentation. It's built up of a patchwork of local seigneurs who are lords of castles, dominate small sort of pockets of land, and pay like nominal homage to the counts of Toulouse. So the castles of the region are many and manifold and very difficult to besiege because this is quite a mountainous region. So Simon and his ecclesiastical compatriots, he's always accompanied by bishops or abbots who are preaching the crusade and preaching against heresy as the crusading army are getting down to the business of doing the fighting and doing the besieging. And what tends to happen is a town surrenders, and when they surrender, the preachers, the ecclesiastical leaders of the crusade, go into the town, often bearing the cross, and they reconsecrate the church because they perceive that the church has been made impure by heresy, and invite the populace to recant their heresy and return to orthodoxy. And sometimes they do. And they are returned to the bosom of the church. And other times they do not. And the pattern that emerges then is that the preachers leave the town again, or leave the castle, and hand over the town to secular justice. And Simon de Montfort and his knights go in, and the results are characterized by essentially mass burnings of those accused of heresy in the town. The accounts of these events are quite bizarre, because most of our accounts are from Catholic authors. And Peter, who I work on especially, comments that those who refuse to recant their heresy throw themselves gladly on the fire. They would rather burn than convert. I find that unlikely. And I think that what's actually going on is quite a brutal throwing of people onto these mass pyres. I think your most recent episode that you released was with a historian at Cardiff, Jan Nikiels. He was talking about how in the 17th century with witches, there was a combination of strangulation and burning. Am I correct in saying that?
Right.
But it's nothing quite so delicate at this period we're talking about. It's mass pyres. But that's the military aspect of the crusade. And there's a far more political narrative to this that goes alongside the persecution, which if you'd like me to, I can speak to afterwards, because an important part of the church will embrace this new machinery of persecution. Basically, Simon de Montfort dies outside of Toulouse in 1218, and his son takes over the leash of the crusade. But his son is far less capable. And in 1224, he relinquishes his claims to the lands that his father took in the Languedoc to King Louis VIII of France. And it's at this point where the kings of France get involved in the Albigensian Crusade. And it's a large part of the modern narrative of the Crusade that the campaign served as the means by which the south of France was incorporated incredibly brutally by the Kingdom of France, making France as we know it today. And so Louis actually dies on the Albigensian Crusade, and his claim to the Languedoc passes to his son, who you might know well as Saint Louis, you may have heard of, Louis IX of France. And in 1229, Louis, alongside his mother, Blanche of Castile, negotiates the Treaty of Paris, in which peace is essentially made in the south. And this is where more of the machinery of persecution that you might be familiar with from a later period is implemented. There's a political angle. Raymond VII of Toulouse at this point, his father Raymond VI died, is forced to marry his daughter, Joan, to the brother of Louis IX, Alphonse of Poitiers, and their heirs will inherit the lands of Raymond of Toulouse, this massive southern principality, essentially subsuming that into the lands of the King of France. But in terms of the repression of heresy, the methods put in place, there's a University of Toulouse forced to be set up. Raymond VII is forced to pay for a University of Toulouse, which teaches Orthodox Christianity. And then a set of laws are put in place. So essentially, those who confess their heresy voluntarily in the region, they aren't treated leniently, but they're not persecuted. They're often relocated to a region not known for heresy, and they're forced to wear yellow crosses to mark them as recalcitrant heretics, and they could take no public office. They're also forced to attend confession 3 times a year in order to make sure they're staying on the straight and narrow. And this is a time when confession isn't necessarily a regular event. I think the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 encourages a good Christian attend confession once a year. So recalcitrant heretics are forced to attend triple the amount, just so essentially the church can keep tabs on them. Non-voluntary confessions of heresy. That means they've been informed upon, results in imprisonment and penance. And all Southerners swore an oath against heresy at the age of discretion, so that they are bound not to engage in heresy. Those who would not recant heresy, like we saw in the Albigensian Crusade, are handed over to secular justice, and with similar results, and die for their heresy, which doesn't go down very well in the South. It's not at this point that the South of France is under the boot of the French, as it were. And inquisitors who are leading these investigations into heresy are quite regularly beaten and or killed by the local populace who don't want them there. And this leads to, in 1242, a group of inquisitors are attacked and killed in Albi, which is one of the traditional centers of heresy. And a royal army is sent south in 1244 and besieges the last heretical stronghold of Montségur, which you should look at pictures of. It is the most stunning castle you'll ever see. And once Montségur falls, 200 heretics were burned to death following. And that was the last real outburst of heresy. But attempts to revive the Cathar Church are present throughout the early 14th century, but never really come to very much. Bernard Guy, who is one of the great inquisitors of his age, I say great sarcastically, he was an eager guy. He was an inquisitor in the South between 1308 and 1323. And he carried out 930 sentences of heresy, of which 42 were handed over to secular justice. So there's a presence of heresy, but also a willingness to recant, or at least say they've recanted. So there's this dwindling throughout the 14th century.
What do we need to know about the heretical beliefs that they were getting arrested for?
So this is a matter of quite some debate within the scholarly field at the moment. So the big debate amongst some historians of the Albigensian Crusade, of which I'm not necessarily one, is whether or not heresy existed in the first place. So I think I'll answer in two parts. I'll answer as if to say, this is what it is if heresy did exist.
Yeah.
And what we understand if heresy didn't, just to give shape to both sides of the debate. If heresy did exist, the beliefs that really threaten the church are about the nature of God, the nature of the world, and the nature of the Bible. So it's worth saying that this is a great age of almost heresies. So you have lots of movement, monastic movements especially. The church authorities look at and are not too sure about this, but we think it's okay. So a great example is the Abbey of Fontevraud, where several of England's kings are buried, just outside Poitiers, and where Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, and Eleanor of Aquitaine are buried at Fontevraud. But its founder, Robert of Arbrissel, begins life as a sort of wandering preacher and hermit. And in the early 12th century, when he's around, church authorities aren't sure whether or not he's a heretic, but fundamentally decide that he's okay. Where they get more worried is with heresies such as that in the south of France, which is more commonly known as the Cathar heresy, although some, me included, try to avoid that term because it's quite loaded and drives southern France's tourist industry. They're either called Cathars or Albigensians. They're called Albigensians at the time. Some things that they preach are very common to what some of the major forces of orthodoxy are preaching, which is priests should undertake a very ascetic lifestyle and dress quite plainly and not overindulge in their lifestyle. And actually, when Orthodox churchmen are preaching against heresy, they adopt a far more ascetic lifestyle because the people of Languedoc see the Cathar preachers living without meat, eggs, any dairy, and walking very plain clothes. And then these bishops and abbots dressed very richly in silk. And the church was thinking, actually, this isn't working. And this is where movements such as the Dominicans and the Franciscans emerge, sort of in response to this heresy in the south of France, as simpler living friars. But it's a fine line. The beliefs that are the real issue are the Cathars are perceived to believe that there are two gods. They're dualist heretics. And the God that the Orthodox Church and Christians today worship is the God of the spiritual realm. And what we would call the devil is the God of the physical realm. So everything earthly is of the devil, everything spiritual is of God, is what they believe. And as such, part of being a Catholic is the rejection of the earthly, which is why they don't eat dairy or any product of animals. And actually, most Cathars appear to only convert fully as they're dying, because essentially you would waste away if you converted early, because it's not a sustainable lifestyle. But as a result of that, they believe that the Old Testament is a work of evil and that the New Testament is the only testament worth following. And they reject John the Baptist as one of the saints, and they reject a formal priesthood. So a lot of Cathar preachers are wandering preachers. That's if there is a heresy in the south of France, that's what the church, amongst some other things.
So it was like a collective heresy versus an individual heresy?
That's a really interesting question. And it depends. So the church, the Orthodox Church, is worried that there is a Cathar church hierarchy. And indeed, there is some evidence of Cathar bishops and a formalized Cathar church. This is when it really depends on if you believe heresy existed or if heresy didn't exist. So if you follow the argument of, he's a fantastic historian, Mark Gregory Pegg. He argues that there was no heresy and that the Albigensian Crusade and the persecution of heresy represents the church forging a heresy as an excuse to wipe out a wandering caste of ascetic preachers. And that is a means by which the church exercised control of a region that it perceived it did not have control of. I think the Albigensian Crusade, whatever way you look at it, is a really tragic episode in history. If you look at it, if you're convinced by what Pegg's arguing, it multiplies that tragedy tenfold, because you had the church essentially inventing a heresy and being responsible for the massacre of thousands, essentially to bring a region of France under what they perceive as being a more orthodox control. Personally, I don't find it a fully convincing argument. I think it falls somewhere in between. I think the church emphasized or over-egged aspects of the heresy, but I also think the evidence we have is compelling enough to suggest that there is a deviation from Catholic doctrine in the south of France, which obviously doesn't justify the response.
The real life Cathars, you mentioned these civil or political, were they tried or were they just rounded up and executed?
It depends when.
Okay.
So if you're talking about the high point of the crusade, we're talking 1209 through to 1218, due process wasn't a high priority of the crusading army. Okay. But during this time, you have aspects separate to the crusading army, really. the sort of nascent mechanisms of the Inquisition, which would follow through. So that's when those accused of heresy or suspected of heresy would be interviewed quite rigorously by an inquisitor who, by the time the Inquisition got going, would often be a Dominican or a Franciscan friar, led most of the movements, and they were documented quite rigorously. So you have what is referred to colloquially as the Doat collection, which is in the Bibliothèque Nationale, and we have records of all of the Inquisitions in the south of France. Because what would happen is you have your inquisitor interrogating a suspected heretic, and you would have another cleric or clerk in the room writing everything down. Actually, it's worth saying this because language is quite important in the Albigensian Crusade, because in the south of France at this time, they weren't speaking the same French as the French of the north. You have two major dialects of French called the Languedoc and the Languedoc. So which is named after how each dialect said yes. So in the north, you have the Languedoc, which is oui, and in the south, you have the Languedoc, which is yes, which is oc. You'd have the inquisitor questioning in either Latin or a form of Northern French a person or member of the Occitan population answering in Occitan, probably with a translator in the middle, then a clerk writing it down, probably in Northern French, and then translating it to Latin. This isn't a collection I worked much on. You have people who really get into it, but the process of translate, like when I say that a machinery of persecution is developing here, it is literally that. There is a very rigorous process by which these inquisitions are being carried out, because I think largely because of the language barrier, they had to be quite rigorous with how they do things.
Once the individual was in that seat being questioned, are they guilty? What was next for them?
But it depends. If you are willing to follow Orthodox practice, and most importantly, if you're willing to tell the church who the real heretics are and inform, you're not getting off, but you're treated relative. This is what I said. I mentioned the yellow crosses. You have people who are former heretics wearing yellow crosses to show people they're former heretics. They're not able to hold public office. But if they've sworn to oppose heresy, they're attending mass regularly, they're attending that thrice yearly confession, you're okay. You've been informed upon and you're brought in and you're found guilty, but you're willing to recant and you're willing to swear to orthodoxy. You'll be given quite rigorous penance and maybe a term of imprisonment. But then following that, if you've shown that you are indeed a good Orthodox Catholic, yellow cross, so on. If you refuse to recant if you are found guilty of heresy and refuse to recant your heresy, then you're handed over to secular justice.
And then secular justice, do they hold a trial or what happens there?
No, as I understand it, the church does the trial and the legwork, and you're handed up to secular justice for punishment, because the church can't be seen to be drawing blood.
So the Inquisition's kind of the judge, and then the enforcers of the punishment are the secular.
Yeah.
Okay. So they're told, here's what the punishment should be, and you just do what you want.
As I understand. And, well, it's not necessarily do what you want. I think it's quite rigidly burning, because there is and there's two reasons for that, but this is research I've heard rather than research I've done. One reason is there is a purifying aspect to dying by fire, which is disgusting, but that's what the belief was. Another aspect is there is a concern amongst the church authorities that if there are bodies of heretics left, that they would see a development of relic cults of martyred heretics. So just as the Catholic Church you would have cults developing around relics of martyrs. So if you had St. Stephen's ankle bone, that would be a source of devotion. The remains of martyred heretics, they worried, would become objects of devotion for heretics and inspire future generations of heretics.
That kind of
There's some
sounds.
very interesting research on that, which I wish was mine, but isn't.
Were there other? So that would be like a possible ritual or practice they would not want to see happen. Were there any other ritual practices or beliefs attributed to them that we could associate with witchcraft accusations?
I've never seen anything akin to a witch's Sabbath, for instance. That devil worship isn't a factor in the persecution of heresy. There's rites of passage. So that the Cathars are accused of rejecting their baptism and refusing to take or uphold oaths, which is and actually touches on some of the same things that later witches are accused of, because that's a breaking down of social convention, and that's a subversion of social order. This is a world based on oaths. Oaths are incredibly important, and if you don't abide by an oath, everything falls apart. And similar to baptism, I think baptism in this period serves an important social spiritual function, because to be baptized is to be inducted into the community of the faithful, and to subvert that and reject that is to weaken the community of the faithful. So that's where parallels it is quite possible to draw, because the threat of heresy is a threat to the social order, just as I think, as I understand it, witchcraft witches were perceived as a threat to social order.
Definitely. And the rejection of baptism, we see that with the so-called witches rejecting their Christian baptism and being re-baptized by the devil. You have that in Salem, a lot of devil baptisms. So we do see that a lot.
And at least in the 13th century, that's terrifying to the organized church, because, of course, the church is responsible for the maintaining and upholding of the integrity of the souls of the faithful. So to reject baptism is to essentially cast yourself out and reject the possibility of salvation, which the person answerable for that is ultimately the Pope. But because this is the Albigensian goes alongside the great age of pastoral concern for the church, which is when the church essentially really cracks down on making sure that people are aware of the condition of their souls. So you have great tracts passed out. This is what heresy is. This is how often you should be going to confession. This is what you do to make sure your soul is in a good condition. An example in England is when you have Magna Carta being made the cornerstone of what the legal system is now. To defy Magna Carta is punishable by excommunication, which is to be cast out of the church. And the English church makes sure that fact is broadcast very widely. If you defy this set of laws, you will be excommunicated. So don't do that. because we're responsible for your souls and we want your souls to be spiritually well. So the rejection of baptism is a massive threat to what the church was trying to do at that time.
I'm also seeing how a conspiracy involving this dualism, they're not necessarily worshiping the devil or following, meeting with him, it's out, devil sabbats and things that witches do. But
No.
believing that he's a god, doesn't that kind of elevate him into a different role, at least, than what the Orthodox would have believed?
Yes, it ascribes the devil more power than the church would want people to perceive. But I think the bigger issue is orthodoxy is that God created the world. Catharism is that the devil created the world as the matter of two creators. So it's taking the act of creation away from God is the deeper heresy there, I think, if that makes sense.
Okay. One of the aspects of your research that I found a connection with is just this rhetoric used to push the narrative about the heresy. We really see that in accusing witches. I'd love to hear a little bit about how Peter used that narrative to drive the crusade, just because it's very similar to driving these hunts in communities. For instance, with Salem, as it exploded and there were more witches to seek out, there was narratives used.
It's important to view what Peter of Levodicene was writing about heresy in terms of what his purpose in writing in the first place was, which was to justify the Albigensian Crusade. He began writing at a point where papal confidence in the Crusade was quite deeply shaken. Actually, in 1213, Pope Innocent III disavowed the Crusade. And I've argued, to mixed reception, that the Historia Albigensis was undertaken as part of a broader rhetorical campaign to restore papal confidence in the Crusade and thereby re-endorse the Crusade. Peter portrays heresy as he does in an attempt to convince the Pope Innocent III that heresy is still a very present threat in the south of France. So the way in which he does that is, and I hope I'm answering your question, Sarah, he mostly relies on biblical rhetoric, and he casts his depiction of heresy in biblical terms. So there's a couple of examples. He relates heresy to the parable of the tares, which Christ gives in Matthew, in which you have tares growing up in the field of the good sower. No matter how good the sower is, you have tares coming up. And the analysis of that parable is very different to what it would be now, because Christ goes on to say, don't rip the tares up because you're going to cause damage to the good crop. Separate it when harvesting. So basically, don't punish heresy. God will do that at judgment. But in the 13th century, it's perceived to be like, no, we need to tear up the tares. In terms of justifying continued crusading to the Pope, it's these tares are still very present. We need to root them up. There's many other examples I could talk about. One that I think is especially striking is Peter refers to the heretics that they're fighting as a generation of vipers, which has manifold meanings. So he's drawing on two references here. One is to Christ's teaching. Christ refers to the Pharisees as a generation of vipers, who are essentially damaging the faithfuls. It would have been the Jewish community at that point, but in the 13th century, it's viewed as the community of the faithful. It's a relationship with God, and they're coming between God and the faithful. But also Isidore of Seville, who wrote this massive etymology of everything in creation, and he assigns a moral assessment of everything in creation. In his description of vipers, he has a frankly mad idea that vipers, the mother beheads the father following reproduction, and then the young tear themselves out of the mother, thus killing the mother in the act of childbirth. And essentially, it's the idea that the viper is conceived and born in the act of murder. And so, in using this rhetoric, Peter is saying, look, if we allow heresy to endure in the South, we're just going to have this cyclical chaos in which the social order is completely torn apart and will ultimately come between the faithful and salvation. Again, it's all coming, there's to view faith and religion and social order as one and the same in this period. And essentially what Peter's saying is heresy is this existential threat to the social order of Christendom, which I suppose if you look at the beginning of the 17th century, witches are an existential threat to the social order of the Commonwealth, I suppose.
Yes, absolutely. And there's like an ecclesiastical threat also by both groups, undermining the authority of the church. The Cathars or Albigensians said having their own itinerant preachers and maybe bishops.
Yes.
Obviously a threat to the established Catholic Church and their authority, their power, their finances in every way. Yeah.
And the Orthodox Church doesn't like to be threatened.
Yeah. Yeah. We see that throughout history.
Yeah, time and again.
Yeah.
And actually I just add a point on this. So one of the important things that those advocating the crusade do is very much tie the beliefs of the Cathars to the ancient heresies of like Mason Christianity. So Peter doesn't necessarily, but a lot of his contemporaries describe Cathars as Manichees. And Manichaeanism was an early Christian heresy of the 4th century, and St. Augustine opposed Manichaeanism and Faustus, and there's this drawing of a chronology of heresy and a chronology of faithlessness that those justifying the Albigensian Crusade place themselves within. It's like, this isn't a new threat to the church. This is a millennia-old threat that we need to be combating time and again, time and again, time and again, thereby sort of justifying this repeated cycle of persecution.
It feels like, frankly, a game of whack-a-mole. You just have the heresy pop up and you suppress it and it pops up again. And eventually it pops up heresy, but there's also witchcraft, things like that pop up and they need to be quelled the same way.
Yes. And I think the Reformation probably just sets all that alight. I think when Luther is doing all his Lutheran things, he's compared to the Cathars of old by those opposing him. And is something that I want to pursue more seriously. But during the French Wars of Religion in sort of the 16th, early 17th centuries, you get this quite intense copying of manuscripts from the era of the Albigensian Crusade, copying and translations. I think half of our surviving manuscripts of the Historia Albigensis are early 17th century French translations. So there's an interest during the French Wars of Religion where you had this religious divide in France again in what was going on back in the 13th century during the Albigensian Crusade, which I'd like to look more into because it's really interesting.
Yeah, it sounds like kind of a manual against heresy, the way that a demonology is manual against witchcraft.
Precisely. And actually, that's a real genre in the 12th and 13th century. It's not called a demonology. They're referred to as exemplar. And you have preachers producing exemplar collections which are these little snippets, like little anecdotes, to be regurgitated in sermons. And so essentially, a preacher should have a textual arsenal of arguments and preaching tools, many of which concern themselves with heresy. So that when preaching and at a loose end, oh, I've got this one for heresy, or if someone challenges him whilst preaching against heresy, he has the exemplar ready to combat it. Which they're fascinating documents, some kind of wacky ones. But yeah. So that's again a similarity is preaching tools.
Yeah.
Learning about this crusade has been very revelatory for me to know that there's this widespread hunt for heretics so many centuries before the hunting that we usually think about on this podcast. Were there other heresies in addition to Catharism at this time?
Yes, quite a lot actually. Catharism attracts the most attention, I think, mostly because of the sheer scale of the reaction and suppression of Catharism. But the 12th century, especially, and into the 13th century, was marked by instances of heresy. So I think if we go back to even earlier than the 12th century, in 1022, a sect of heretics are discovered in Orleans during the reign of Robert II of France. And they represent the first burning of heretics in Christendom since the 4th or 5th century. So that's like the reintroduction of the threat of heresy to Christendom. But then through the 12th century, you have the Cathars, of course. You have the Bogomil heresy, which appears to have come from Bulgaria, but moved westward. And there's a long-standing debate, which I try not to get involved with, about whether or not Bogomilism is the sort of parent heresy, Catharism. I'm inclined to think it's not, but some people think that it is. The other sort of large movement of heresy, contemporary with Catharism, is Waldensianism, which has some of the same beliefs as Catharism, but the beliefs are less controversial. I think Peter of Levodosene characterizes them. He talks to the Walden. They were evil men, but very much less perverted than other heretics. And they agreed with Orthodox Christianity in many matters and differed in some. Their error arose in 4 major points. They wore sandals in imitation of the apostles, which is awful. They also condemned the swearing of oaths, and their major heresy was that it was okay for anyone to administer communion, even though they hadn't received holy orders, which wasn't very good, but not nearly as bad as the Cathars. I think wearing sandals and giving communion was more acceptable than believing the devil created the world.
Mary Bingham is back with another enlightening Minute with Mary. The early sources regarding heresy were written by dissonant voices or lost voices, and this reflected a critique of modern society, according to historian Dr. Claire Taylor. These dissenting beliefs created a gray area in defining heresy by challenging what would have been deemed by some as necessary change in the church versus what was actually defined as heretical in medieval times. Historians who specialize in heresy, such as Louis Pulford and Claire Taylor, can look at early text and separate what was actually heretical versus those views which challenged what simply threatens the church. Please listen to Dr. Claire Taylor on YouTube. The link to her interviews are in the show notes. Thank you, Mary.
And now Sarah has In Witch Hunts News.
Haiti holds a profound place in the Americas. After becoming the second independent nation in the hemisphere in 1804 and the first independent Caribbean state, the United States would not recognize this achievement until 1862, when it finally established diplomatic relations by appointing Benjamin F. Whitten as its first commissioner and consul general to Haiti, marking the U.S.'s formal acknowledgement of Haiti's sovereignty. Named for its mountainous terrain, Haiti's independence from France marked a revolutionary moment in world history. Media reports of witchcraft accusations and violent attacks against elderly Haitians have circulated around the globe, raising many questions and assumptions. Let's learn what we can together about Haiti's rich culture and the organizations working to protect human rights there. But first, please join me in 10 seconds of silence to acknowledge the innocent men and women who recently lost their lives in the elder witchcraft allegations attack. To read more specifics from locals about the innocent lives lost, please check the news link in our show notes. Now, let's learn about a Haitian organization striving to promote, protect, and defend the fundamental human rights of all Haitians. Quote, "With many hands, the load is not heavy." That's a Haitian proverb and is the header on the donation page for Haiti's National Human Rights Defense Network. In the organization's website About section, it states that the roots of democracy are desperately trying to take hold in Haiti. Here is a foundational definition of democracy. Democracy is a system of government in which power lies with the people, who either exercise it directly or through freely elected representatives. Let's examine how Haiti's National Human Rights Defense Network describes their crucial work on their website. According to the National Human Rights Defense Network's website statement, democracy cannot happen with a flawed foundation. In Haiti, the fundamental principles of justice are not applied to those with power and influence, money, and eminence, as different socioeconomic status means different status and treatment before the law. The National Human Rights Defense Network operates through two essential groups: the Port-au-Prince Central Staff and the local departmental network staff and volunteers. The central office comprises 12 working group commissions focused on critical areas like human rights education, police monitoring, prison oversight, and judicial system monitoring. Their local departmental networks consist of trained human rights defenders committed to fostering human rights in their communities. To persevere, the National Human Rights Network depends on the commitment and solidarity of concerned individuals and organizations, both in Haiti and abroad, to support their fight against injustice and impunity. They call on all individuals, organizations, and governments to demonstrate their commitment to these precious principles by seeking change where these principles are ignored. Please reach out to them if your agency has support to offer at web.rnddh.org. You can also find this link in the episode show description. As Executive Director of End Witch Hunts, I want to emphasize our dedication to United Nations Resolution 47.8, the elimination of harmful practices related to accusations of witchcraft and ritual attacks, passed by the UN Human Rights Council in June 2021. This resolution specifically addresses the harmful practices we're seeing today. We also want to express our dedication to standing with the people of Haiti who helped to find freedom in the Americas. Together with the International Network of Advocates, we stand committed to implementing this resolution and ending persecution based on witchcraft accusations throughout the Americas and worldwide.
Thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome.
And thank you for tuning into Witch Hunt.
Join us every week.
Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.